The biotic causes, and these are living things, and those are the insects, the diseases, animals, the rodents and whatnot, moles, voles, things that may cause damage. And then the abiotic things that can cause plant problems, and those are the non-living things. So they might be mechanical, where you leave some type of pruning tie wrapped on the plant and it girdles it, environmental, and then chemical, or like a pesticide drift. So knowledge itself is a tool, and that's what we try to do with Extension Master Gardener training, is increase your knowledge about some of these common plant problems we have. It's very helpful to know the time of year specific diseases and insects occur, because there's certain, probably the best one I can think of is in May, I will frequently have people calling and saying, my lawn is brown, I must have grubs. Rarely, it is extremely rare to ever see damage from white grubs to a lawn in May. So that is automatically a red flag for me that there must be something else going on here because of the time of the year. So, it's very helpful to know, what do we typically see at certain times of the year? What are the symptoms and signs to look for? And when do they tend to appear? Recent and past weather patterns. It's a good idea to keep, we all know that. We live in Nebraska, we keep track of the weather. So has it been wet? Was it a wet, rainy spring? Then, we're going to see more foliar diseases, like fungal diseases, in a wet, rainy year. Past weather patterns. In 2012, we had a very severe drought. So 3 to 5 years after a severe drought, we begin to see things like verticillium wilt in trees. We might see an increase in borer damage to trees, just our native borers, because during those stress years, plants' resistance lowers, and then they're more likely to become infected or infested with things like verticillium wilt or a borer. But it takes 3 to 5 years, depending on the health of the plant to begin with, before we start seeing those symptoms. So a lot of times, what you're seeing happened, it actually infected the plant 3 or 4 or 5 years ago. So being aware of recent as well as past weather patterns, that's part of knowledge being a tool and helping to diagnose plant problems. Knowing the plant location, where it's growing, and the history, how it was cared for. If you have a shade-loving plant growing in a full sun location, that could very likely be the problem. The growing requirements of the plants. It's good to know those as well, again, just to make sure it's not planted in a location where it's suffering just because of the growing conditions and growing site. Questions to ask about the plant, to get at the history of the plant. There is somebody, Joanne, I think, you don't have your microphone muted. I'm not sure who. So if you could mute it, it's in the lower left-hand corner of your screen typically. If you kind of scroll over it, a microphone will come up and you can click on that and it'll mute you. But some questions to ask about the history of the plant. What is the plant? You might assume that every homeowner does know that, but they don't, or they usually will say my tree's dying or my shrub is dying, etc. And then the first thing, of course, to ask is, well, what type of tree do you have? How long has the plant been in the location where it's currently growing? And plant age, plant size, you might think, isn't that the same thing? Plant age, plant size? No, I mean, I've encountered situations where somebody would call and they're talking about their tree, and you ask the plant size. Or I've just made the assumption that it's been planted there for a long time because it's a 15-foot tall tree, or let's say an 8-foot tall tree. And, I'll say, how long has it been in the location? Well, it was planted this spring. And this is kind of vice versa. It was planted this spring. So I might automatically assume it's 6 foot tall. And then all of a sudden, as we're talking, they say something about it being a 10-foot tall tree. I'm going, well, wait a minute, when was it? If I ask the plant age. And that might be a plant that was transplanted maybe moved in with a tree spade. And that could be the issue itself. So getting that in, all that information, gathering all that data is important. Describing the growing conditions of the site, the care practices, how have you irrigated, fertilized, Does it have mulch? Is it, has it been pruned? Just some of the care practices. What has been done to or near the plant recently or in the past? This is a question that we might tend to forget until we can't solve the problem. We're like, well, this is weird, or I don't know what's going on. And then I'll remember, have you done anything near or to the plant? Have you dug an underground line? Have you put in a new foundation around your home? Something like that. What else? I don't know if this is going to work as well with this, but if anybody wants to chat a question or two, what questions you would ask, feel free to do so. I'm looking for the chat box. There it is. I'm going to look at it. That's okay, Tim. Okay, David, Cherry County is not getting audio. The problem with this is I don't automatically see the chat like everybody else, but I don't know if somebody, I'm going to keep teaching. Elizabeth, I don't know if you'd be willing to call David in Cherry County. He said they're not getting audio via computer, so he has me on the phone. How do I fix? I'm sorry, David. I don't know either. This is the first time we're using Zoom for this, so we'll write down some of the problems we have and hopefully we'll solve them as we go. Or maybe somebody else can chat. Yeah, Nicole is trying to chat. So I'm going to go on now. Thanks, Nicole and Elizabeth, for trying to help. Okay, questions to ask about the problem. Pretty soon I'm going to be getting to some good pictures here, but I want to get through the basics here. The question, kind of the systematic approach that's recommended in this Diagnosing Plant Problems from Virginia. Obviously, what are the signs or symptoms, especially if somebody's calling you on the phone? What's happening to the plant? Why do you think something's wrong? What are you seeing? Browning, yellowing, spots, chewing. So do you actually see any insects, rots, or spots, as we call it on Backyard Farmer, bugs, rots, and spots? Is there any kind of a pattern to the damage? Is it top down on the plant, which usually indicates a root issue? Is it from the bottom up? Like with tomatoes, that's frequently going to indicate a disease issue, a fungal disease issue. And how is the plant spreading? Is the problem spreading from plant to plant? Is it only affecting that one plant? Is it spreading rapidly? And are different types of plants affected? If there's many different types of plants affected in a landscape, most likely it's not a biotic. It's not a disease or insect. It's more likely to be abiotic, and more likely to be environmental, possibly mechanical. So because most of our diseases and insects are what we refer to as being host specific. So what will infect one type of plant will not infect another type of plant. And this is a concern that we usually hear from clients. They'll call and say, well, if I don't control it on this plant, is it going to kill all the other plants in my landscape or my garden? But luckily, the majority of plants are host specific. So if only one type of plant is affected, then maybe you could lean towards a biotic, like an insect or disease. But if it's many different types, you might want to start asking some questions about, environment, looking at weather conditions, hail, that type of thing. When were the symptoms first noticed? Were they just, and a lot of times this is a tough one, because when they're first noticed, it's usually when the person calls you, even though the symptoms may have been there a while. But it's a good question to ask, because they may have, well, I noticed it a month ago and I've sprayed this and I've sprayed this and I've sprayed this and nothing's helped, so now I'm calling you. So it's still a good question to ask. And I don't know what else. You might want to just think a little bit about what other questions would you ask to take this systematic approach. And again, I encourage you to read through that Virginia publication, because I'm just covering a few of the basic ones that they suggest. Okay, have an open mind, because there can be many different causes for one symptom. Brown spots in lawns are a good example. Brown spots, it's kind of like people. You can have a headache, but there's many different causes for headaches. Brown spots in lawns can be caused by a gas spill. the neighbor's dog, your own dog. Maybe the irrigation, automatic irrigation heads are not overlapping. They're overwatering one area and underwatering another area, so it could simply be a drought area. Insects, diseases, numerous things can cause brown spots in lawns, so many different causes for one symptom. The obvious suspect may not be the guilty party. And a couple of examples here: wilt. You know, when a plant wilts, we automatically assume it's dry and we need to water. But plants, there's wet wilt. Plants will wilt if they're getting too much water. So tattered tree leaves, any kind of tattered leaves, people have a tendency to think there must be an insect chewing on them. And they might apply an insecticide. And we just, with pollinator protection, protecting our beneficial insects, we need to find and identify what the cause of the problem is before we're reaching for a control, at least a chemical control method. So tattered tree leaves can be caused by wind tear. They can be caused by a disease where the disease weakened part of the leaf and then the wind came along and knocked that weakened portion out. There can be many different causes for tattered tree leaves. Not all problems are insects or diseases. As I've been talking about, there's the abiotic. So mechanical, environmental, chemical. There's a lot of lookalikes. So I'm going to show you some lookalikes, and you may not think, you may look at this and think, well, those two insects, they look similar, but they look very different. But stop and think, you don't have them side by side. You don't have a good picture side by side. Somebody has just brought you in one of these as a sample. Now you might look at this and say, ooh, that's long and narrow and it's kind of green. Maybe it's an emerald ash borer. If you didn't have them side by side here. But one is an emerald ash borer and the other one is a honeysuckle flat-headed borer. So we do have things that can look very similar, especially when you're only looking at one of them. If they're side by side, sometimes it's very obvious. But when they're not side by side, it's not as obvious. These look very much alike. These are two different diseases in the lawn, but can you distinguish between them? Not very readily. The one on the left is brown patch. The one on the right is summer patch. So how do you distinguish those? Well, those are things you learn by taking classes like this and just reading the landscape diagnostic book, having some of those tools, visiting with your master extension educator assistant. But with brown patch, excuse me, with brown patch, I call it, you get down on your hands and knees. I call it the hands and knees and nose diagnosis. Get down on your hands and knees and you look very closely at these green grass blades and you will find these lesions. So that's where I was talking about knowledge is a tool and just knowing what signs and symptoms to look for to diagnose the different problems. And most of you know this. So, but with summer patch, this is a root disease. So you actually have to dig up a sample, or the person has to bring in a plug with the soil so you can check out those roots because it infects the roots. You will not find any kind of a lesion on the grass blade. Now, sometimes you can have two things going on at one time, but typically it seems to be more one over the other. Here's some lookalikes. Here's some of those tattered leaves I was talking about earlier. In the upper left, it's oak leaf tatters, which is just kind of a combination of things. We're not 100% sure what causes it. Might be viral. But basically, the leaf was weakened, and then wind came along and kind of tore it out. Sometimes they just grow this way. They kind of become deformed. So we might think there might be some chemical issues here. It's one of those things we're not real sure what causes it. Hackberry tatters, that's another one where you can see the leaves are really young in this picture. We suspect some of it might be that they maybe have gotten herbicide drift early in the spring, and as those leaves are unfurling, and then it's weakened tissue, and again that tender growth is blowing around in the wind, and it just tears out parts of those. The bottom left is a sawfly slug, and you can actually see the insect here, but we're not always lucky enough to have the insect present. But that is why we ask the person, are you seeing any insects? Are you seeing any spots? And then the last one is just hail damage on a lilac leaf. So it's easy to jump to, if somebody calls and says, my leaves are full of holes, it's easy to jump to the conclusion that it's an insect, but it may not be. So ask those questions. Lookalikes, here's some lookalikes. You have tomato leaves that are all distorted, curled up. Now on here, they look different, but the description, somebody would call you and say, my tomato leaves look funny. They're a little curled, they're a little rolled. And usually over the phone, the first thing we typically think of is a herbicide drift. And this upper left is herbicide. But on the upper right, it's physiological leaf roll. It's physiological. There's no disease, there's no insect. It's usually certain varieties are more likely to do it. We see it on plants that have been fertilized a lot with nitrogen, maybe after a hot spell. But it's physiological, it doesn't kill the plant. You might get a little sunburn on your tomatoes if it happens when you have lots of red tomatoes on there. But the plant usually continues to grow and does fine. And if you look at it, the leaves look very normal. They're just rolled up. Whereas the leaves over here, even the stems, do not look normal at all. And then that bottom one is a virus, tobacco mosaic virus. So we really want to, and when people call with my tomato leaves are curled up, look funny, the first question is, are there other things in the garden or the landscape affected? Because if there are other types of plants affected, then more likely it might be a herbicide drift. But if the only thing affected is a tomato, then more likely we're looking at physiological leaf roll or a virus. There's another lookalike, browning on the edges of leaves. Usually we refer to that as a leaf scorch. And it's usually a sign that the tree is not getting water to the leaves fast enough. The leaves are losing water faster than the roots can replace it. So we might think it needs more water. We might think it needs, there's a root issue. And it could be any of those things, but it could also be a trunk issue. So it's really tough to tell sometimes. But the one here, this is physiological leaf scorch. It may be a younger plant that's not quite established yet. That's why we ask that question. How long has it been in its location? How large is it? What is the growing condition? So if you have a large-leaved maple growing on a very windswept site, maybe it was recently transplanted, much more likely to get physiological leaf scorch. And then this one is leaf scorch from verticillium wilt. That's a fungal disease that grows in the water conducting tissue. So the roots may be fine, the leaves may be fine, but the water can't get fast from the roots to the leaves quickly enough because there's clogging in the xylem and the phloem, or the xylem. But sometimes you can cut open that stem and you'll see some discoloration. And then that helps you to confirm that that's the disease. Okay, positive identification. I'm almost to the point where we get to do some role playing here. I hope you guys have fun with that. But why positive identification? Well, I really don't have to tell you guys that. It's pretty obvious. But successful, it's the only way to have successful, cost-effective control. Or to even just determine if control is even needed. In many cases, we need to change our care practices. We need to change the management. Maybe we need to change the plant. Maybe it's just the wrong plant in the wrong location. And that's what needs to be done. But if it is a disease, or it is an insect, or even animal damage, the only way we're going to have successful, cost-effective control is to know exactly what we're dealing with. And most organisms are not damaging pests. So, we need to positively identify what the cause is before we ever, especially attempt pesticide control. Many problems are due to the environment or incorrect management. So as I said earlier, we need to, change the plant completely because it's the wrong plant for the location, or maybe it's just the weather and the plant's just going to have to look tough for a while. Or we need to change our management practice. So you see these eggs on a plant. And you guys can be thinking to yourself, is your first instinct is I'm going to squish those little buggers before they hatch and eat my plant? Or are you thinking, this is interesting, I wonder what it is? I'm going to let it go and see what hatches. And maybe you see these little black critters crawling around your plant. Is your first instinct, I'm going to squish those little buggers before they get bigger and eat my plants? Or do you just enjoy them for a while and see what they grow into? Now this one's a little more interesting. And hey, that's very colorful. And what's it doing to those aphids? Most of you maybe even know what this is already. But again, it's a lady beetle. So it's a beneficial. So we need to positively identify things too, so we can especially protect our pollinators, protect our beneficials, and we're not trying to control those, accidentally control them. Okay, this is where we're going to do my hands-on activity of role playing, and I hope this works. I kind of sent all the information out to the coordinators. I know this is a lot of reading up here, but I'm going to leave these instructions up here. I'm actually going to give you guys about 20 to 30 minutes. You may want to get on and say, we're ready to move on. But basically, your educators there, your coordinators, have some sheets of paper with some problems on them. They're going to break you into small groups of 2 to 4, 5, or 6, whatever works best. Once you are broken into those groups, I want you to select one person, or if you're a larger group, it can be 2 people. And those people will be the clients. So that's the person who's calling in with the question or bringing the question to the extension office. Now, whoever is the client in the group, coordinators, you can give them one of these plant problems. There's an arborvitae question, a maple question, hawthorn, spirea, and a tomato question. So you can go ahead and give the client only the sheet of paper with the question. Nobody else should see the pictures. Nobody else should see or be able to read the information, or it won't be as much fun. So then the client will ask at the top of the page is there's a line with a bunch of asterisks on it. Whoever the client is, you can tell them, the other master gardeners, what the time of the year is, and you can ask the question. But then I want you to stop. I don't want you to share any other information on that paper or show the picture to the others until they have asked the right question to gather that information. So kind of what you're doing here is you're practicing asking the right questions. So, and then after the client asks the questions again, you might want to take some time as extension master gardeners, just kind of, you won't do this in front of a regular client, but tonight I would like you to just first take some time about what would be some good questions to ask in this situation. Okay, and you may go ahead and feel free to that, Virginia Diagnosing Plant Problems handout. And then again, just a reminder, the client should only share any plant care or history information if the master gardeners in your group ask you the right questions. So if you have any questions, I'm going to look at the chat box here. Does anybody, and if you can get on, you can unmute yourself and get on and ask a question or chat it in the box. But I'm going to give you, I don't know, I'm going to give you at least 20 minutes to do this. And if you want more time, you can have more time. But again, I said it earlier, we're going to try to do a little bit more of this year, so you don't have to just stare at a screen and listen to me talk all night. Okay, everybody? I'm going to mute myself, and I'm going to let you have some fun. I will be here. I'll be watching the chat box. If somebody types in a question, I will try to answer. Have fun. Problems as well. I'll give everybody a few minutes to turn your attention back to the screen. I'm going to go over the chat here a little bit. There's some I asked people what other questions they might ask. And Nicole, I don't know if was one of the questions, is it near a concrete or block wall? When I saw that question, I thought it was for whoever was having trouble getting audio. But you know what? That's a great question to ask about a plant, especially when they have browning of leaves. Is it growing someplace where there's a lot of reflection from the site? Other questions suggested were how long have the symptoms been present? Where did the plant come from? You know, what was the source? That's a great one. Sometimes we have southern plants that come from a southern source and they just may not do well here. And if the same type of plant came from a northern source, it would do perfectly fine. Have they done anything to correct the problem? Now, that's a great question. Because sometimes you find out what they've done to correct the problem is actually causing more problems. But it is a great question to ask. So good job from Norfolk. Tree planting depth. You know, how deep was the tree planted? Were girdling roots checked for, and were they cut? Really, the list of questions can go on and on. Do you see, from Howard County, do you see any webs? Are there actually any worms? Is the brown needle damaged? Not quite sure what you're trying to ask there. Whole bunch of other ones. Do you see any insects? Is there any pattern to the leaf damage? Not just on the plant itself, but on the leaf itself. Is it on one limb, top of the tree, bottom? How old is the tree? What are the growing conditions and care? When did you notice the problem? All good questions. Let's see. Are the tomato fruits exposed to sun directly? Do you see any small holes in the bark near the soap? These are some questions, I guess, for the questions I gave you guys to ask. It says, can we keep going without a break before ice snow hits? I'm fine with that. If anybody does not want to do that, I will just keep teaching. If you need to get up and move around, get some refreshments, go ahead and do that. But I'm fine with doing that. I'm going to go ahead and do that. So I did have I think my next slide was to take a break time. I was going to come back and give you the answers, but first I have to brag that this is my parents' farm in North Dakota. It was the prettiest place in the country in Farm and Ranch magazine a couple years ago, but the best place to vacation. Anyway, I brag about them. You can see where I get some of my love of plants from my mom. Okay, so my maple tree seems to be dying. What do you think is wrong? Does anybody want to chat? Or even just take your phone off mute? And some of you that have that? Or do you just want me to give you the answers? Water stress, raised bed. Okay. The answer is, and you can write it in here, the answer is the raised bed. If the person with the maple tree, the key question here was, have you done anything recently around this tree? And for the people, those of the groups that have that question, if that question was asked, then the answer, the information in on your sheet was that a 2-foot deep raised bed had been built up and around the tree, and people tend to do this, and it does cause a lot of, the tree was suffocating, basically cuts off that oxygen supply to the roots, and eventually the tree starts to decline and typically dies from the top back. So in this case, you had to ask the right question. Have you done anything to the tree or around the tree recently? Okay, I heard about bagworms killing evergreens. Someone said they are brown and look like the part of the tree. I think my evergreen has hundreds of them. They are brown things all over the entire tree. What do I need to spray to kill these bagworms? And these are actual questions that I have received in the office and actual pictures that I have received in the office. So I'm not making these up to be silly or facetious or anything, but what was those of you that had this? Anybody want to type it in? Or to speed things up, do you want me just to continue on? Cones. Water damage, male cones. Good job. Yes, those are natural. Those are the flowering cones on the tree. They are not bagworms at all. Bagworms At some point in, you know, late May, early June, mid-June, a bagworm might be about that size, but there wouldn't be, it probably would not be as prolific. And if you look very closely, these were actually just the cones, the flowering cones, and completely natural. No control needed whatsoever. The leaves of my hawthorn tree are covered with orange spots. Some of the leaves are turning yellow and dropping off. Is my tree dying? Can I spray something to save it? This is, I'm just going to go on, this is hawthorn cedar rust. But again, the key here was, you know, the volunteers that were trying to solve the problem, they were not allowed to see a picture of this until they actually asked, will you bring a sample in? Will you take a picture of the problem and email it to us? Either one. And not, you know, I would, even if I think I know what it is over the phone, I will always end the conversation with, this is what it sounds like, this is what I think it is. But if you want to take a picture and send it to me, or bring me a sample in, I might be wrong. And it does happen. People will send me a picture and I'm like, whoa, I was way off. You know, a picture is worth 1,000 words. So I always, anybody, if you had the maple question, you didn't have a picture, but everybody else had a picture, but they could not see the picture unless they asked for it. And I did tell everybody, I said, at some point, if they're not asking for a sample, then go ahead and offer to bring one in. But this is cedar hawthorn rust. And it's not, you know, in wet years, we see it. A tree would have to be severely infected year after year and get severe defoliation for it to really have much of a negative effect on the plant. So, you know, when it's at this stage, it's much too late to apply a fungicide. They would not be applying a fungicide at this stage because fungicides prevent the disease rather than control it or kill the fungus. So if they do say they want to control the disease, then we would be recommending that they apply a fungicide early in the spring, just as those leaves are starting to unfurl and leaf out. And if it's a wet, rainy spring, you might make 2 or 3 applications according to label direction. But this is typically, these foliar leaf diseases are ones that, especially on an ornamental tree rather than a fruit tree, the homeowner can choose not to control them. They could rake up these leaves and get rid of them and discard them and maybe manage it that way a little bit. Okay, the leaves of our bridal wreath spirea are turning brown. We applied a fungicide, but it does not seem to be helping. What else can we do to save this hedge? Provides privacy and we don't want to lose it. Nobody ever wants to lose their plants. So in this case, it was in September. You know, I had everybody tell what time of the year it is because that's a key sometimes, you know, when we know what's going on. So in this case, I went out. This was a commercial entity had actually asked me this question. So I went out and looked at these trees or these shrubs. And if you look really closely, and you start to unfurl these leaves right here, if you start to unfurl them, you find out they're webbed together. They're stuck together with webbing. The other thing you notice is the browning is actually kind of a skeletonizing where the green tissue has been scraped off. So then you know it's an insect. There are leaf rollers. We refer to these as leaf rollers. They're frequently seen on the tip of plants. But people see that browning and they think they have a disease. So look closely. If you unfurl it, again, you'll see webbing. The insects were long gone. This was in September, so I did not find any insects. Sometimes you'll find them in a cocoon or pupal case. But I could see the webbing. The leaves were rolled and webbed. And in this, again, rarely is a insecticide control needed if the homeowner wanted to do that. And the timing of the insecticide application would be much earlier in the season when they very first start noticing any damage. But at this time of the year, just you clip them off, clip off. And you can do that even when they're active and the insects are there. You can just clip off the tips and destroy them. My tomatoes have hard white spots in them. Most of the spots are beneath the skin. Why are they doing this? Are they safe to eat? And the answer here, There can be more than one answer here, but the answer in this particular case was stink bugs. It's a little in kind of what gave that away, but you know, heat, the environmental conditions, especially really hot, dry conditions, can cause sometimes getting white walls and whatnot inside of our tomatoes. But here it kind of showed the stippling. Stink bugs insert their mouth parts, kind of like a needle, into the fruit and causes kind of some of this yellow stippling, but it can also cause these hard white spots underneath. Not much you can do about it at this point, and yes, they are safe to eat. Sometimes they may not taste as good, but they're safe to eat. So, I know somebody from Buffalo says, new growth. What about sending samples to the diagnostic lab? Okay, well, I did talk about that in one of my earlier slides. Under the tools that I had, it's the slide. If you look at your PowerPoint, it's the slide with the dog trying to get the stick through the fence. And I did recommend that it's fine to send samples to the diagnostic lab. You can either have the homeowner do that themselves, or you can, if you're talk to your extension person, and if that's something that they do, then that is something that can be done as well. But that was probably one of my earlier slides. I talked about the diagnostic clinic. Okay, so what I was going to do here after the break, I was going to come back and just kind of solve some plant problems and identify a few mysteries. This is, and what I do this every year with my local master gardeners. And what I do is I save pictures of the samples that have been sent to me the previous year. So summer of 2016, I took pictures of things that came in. People sent me pictures, and I just save them every year. And then every year we go through, okay, this is what we had last year. And I try to do something that's a little new, a little different, but also always try to cover some of the common things, because those are the questions we're going to answer the most. So here's, why do my pine, and the question is the actual homeowner's question. Why do my pine trees appear to have soap on them? And the first one, this was 35 years, I'd never had this question. And what it actually is it was kind of interesting. It does look like soap. I'm like, are they fooling me? Are they tricking me? Or what's the case here? But what happens is kind of a crude, when it's really dry weather or hot, dry weather, kind of a crude soap can actually develop on the outside of pine trees. And then if it gets really, or other trees as well, but it's most common with pine trees. You know, they used to make pine tar soap. So it's just kind of a mixture of salts and acids and whatnot, and they kind of dry and get on the outside of the stem. And then if it gets really wet and rainy, they actually suds up and bubble up. So this gentleman sent me a picture of probably about 10 pine trees, and every one of them was doing it. So natural. It's really natural, a little bit unusual, but completely natural and not harmful to the tree, other than a sign that it probably had been a little hot and dry. So that was a new one to me, kind of a fun one to get. I wish we could interact a little bit more. That's one thing I don't like about Zoom, is I can't see your guys' chat right down in the corner. But if somebody wants to type something in, it pops up. It does pop up that I have a new chat, so I can check it. There we go. I gotta read it. Spittlebugs. Yep. You know what? It does look like spittlebugs, but it was not spittlebugs. Let me go back. Okay. There is an insect called the spittlebug and you often see it around the stem, smaller around the stem of a plant frequently. And usually if you go in there and you start taking your hand and feeling it, you'll actually find the insect inside there. But it looks, spittlebug looks just like this on a plant, only it's usually on the stem or closer to the leaves. It's usually not flowing down the side of the pine tree. So in this case, it was actually a natural thing rather than spittlebugs, but good job, Panhandle. What's wrong with my peony leaves? Okay. And the answer here, now I did provide if you want to, I know my slides, if you only have the 6 per page, they're a little bit small. So I did, I don't know if you have it or if your educator gave it to you, your coordinator gave it to you, but it's just the answer and recommendation for Platte Diagnostics, and then it's just 1 through 10 on the front and 11 through 20 on the back. And if you want to write your answers there so you can write them a little bit larger, feel free to do that. Otherwise, you can write it on the slide as well. But the issue here was powdery mildew. And I include, you know, even though powdery mildew is a very common problem we see in the landscape on lilacs, especially sometimes we'll see it in shady areas of the lawn. We're starting to see it a little bit more often on peonies. That's not something we've typically seen it on often, but we're starting to see it a little bit more frequently for some reason. But of course, with powdery mildew, again, this is a little bit different fungal disease. It doesn't have to be really wet and rainy to see a lot of powdery mildew. Usually we see it where the plant is in some shade or poor air circulation. So site location is very important. If it's becoming bad enough that they do want to attempt to control it, at this stage it's too late. Unless it's pretty early in the spring and a lot of the other leaves are not yet infected, then you know, a fungicide may help at that point. But usually if it's later in the season, then the key is sanitation. Once you can, in the fall, rake up the damaged leaves, in the fall, cut the plant back. And then if you would want to apply a fungicide, it would have to be done as those leaves are starting to grow in the spring to really be effective. So powdery mildew on peonies. What is on my maple branch? And the leaves are kind of sticky too. You can kind of see here where the leaves are a little bit shiny, so they felt sticky as well. Okay, this particular problem is actually woolly aphids. There are some scale insects that, especially cottony maple scale, but it looks a little bit different. But aphids, as well as scales, can make the leaves sticky, because they feed on the sap of the plant, and if they can't digest all the sap of the plant, they kind of exude it out of their bodies, and that's what makes the leaves kind of sticky. So, but this is I said woolly aphids. They're kind of peculiar. The nymphs here are kind of purplish. As the season goes on, they kind of develop these little waxy filaments, and that's where they get the name woolly aphids. We've been seeing a little bit more of them the last couple of years, but as a general rule, they're not a real issue. It's something that a homeowner could definitely ignore if they would choose to ignore it. So woolly aphids on maple. What are these berries, and can I eat them? This was a picture that was sent to me, actually from another county. They look delicious, but they are common pokeweed, and they are actually toxic. Now, this is one of those native plants that grows where if you start to read more about it, you will read that certain parts of the plant at certain times of the year was actually eaten by pioneers, by the Native Americans, but it had to be done correctly. It had to be, you know, prepared correctly. But as a general rule, this is a plant that we would tell people it's a weed and it is toxic. So no, do not eat those berries. And I would encourage you as master gardeners, you know, be 120% sure of your identification, especially when people are asking, can I eat it? Either choose not to answer it, turn it over to the extension person, or be 150% sure of your plant ID. But this is common pokeweed. I'm a commercial grower and my onions are turning white and brown and drying up. What's wrong? Here, I want somebody to tell me what the answer is to this. And I have 2 checks. Okay, Elizabeth said common pokeweed, good job, or at least in Paul County. What was that name again? It was, well, common pokeweed. That's probably Elizabeth was answering. Common pokeweed. The Panhandle says that the problem here is mites. Betty is asking, does the red stem help indicate toxicity? Not that I'm aware of. I mean, I assume you're saying, could any red-stemmed plant be toxic? I don't believe so. Thrips, the Panhandle also says thrips. I am asking, what would a master gardener answer to this question? Kind of a trick question. You are a master gardener and you have been given this question. As a master gardener, what is your answer to the client? Okay, well, your answer is, first of all, state policy does not allow master gardeners to answer questions of commercial growers. So your answer is, I need to refer this to the extension staff. But the answer is, let's see, is thrips. This is thrip damage on onions. They kind of scrape the plant and the leaves with their mouth parts. At this stage, with this much damage, it would be almost impossible to control thrips. They need to be controlled very early in the season. But I intentionally put this in just as a reminder that if somebody says they're a commercial grower, state policy says that those questions should be turned over to the extension staff. This vine is growing on my shrub. Is it poison ivy? How do I control it? There you go, Dakota County, you got it. Ask more questions and turn it over to an expert. I'm giving you a little bit of time to answer. I'm hoping that this allows some for discussion just locally, people to do some sharing. But I'm also trying to be cognizant of the fact that we might want to wrap up a little early tonight so those out west can get home with it being snowing. Virginia creeper, you're right, Nicole. This is Virginia creeper. This is a vine that people very often think is poison ivy, but it has the leaves it has 5 leaflets. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Did this one have 6? Maybe 6. But Virginia creeper is one of our native vines. In the fall, it's very bright red, beautiful purplish red, but so is poison ivy. But poison ivy, again, will have the 3 leaflets. Leaves of 3, leave it be. So if it's growing, and this one is planted by a lot of birds because it has a purple berry that birds do love to eat, so it is often planted in our shrub borders, fence lines. It's a beautiful vine, but it's very vigorous, and it would take over a shrub area eventually. And this is one where, again, about the only way to control it is with that glove method. You can possibly keep pruning it off at ground level, and eventually it would run out of stored food, but you'd really have to, the homeowner would have to keep up with continually pruning that off at ground level. Otherwise, many of you have heard of the glove method, where you put the chemical resistant glove on, put a cotton glove over that, spray it with Roundup, and then you just kind of reach in and you grab the leaves and you try to get as much on the Roundup on the leaves as you can and get very little of it on the green tissue of your shrub. So a little bit challenging, but that is the answer. Okay, why are my maple leaves turning brown and some are falling off? Okay, I know that the Panhandle here is saying it can kill trees. I've never seen Virginia creeper kill a tree, but I suppose if the tree's small enough and it shades it out enough over time, it could eventually kill the tree. Oh, good question. What time of the year is it? It is probably June, early June. Late May, early June. You guys must have a vigorous Virginia creeper out in the Panhandle. Yeah, in Buffalo County, if you want to take a break, do you mean everybody? Or do you guys just want to step away? Panhandle says yeah. Yes to the break. I'm fine with taking a 10-minute break. Keep going. No. What do I do? Let's keep going. I think.
Hey Kelly, this is Tim. I'm getting a red recording dot, so it may in fact be recording even though it told me I needed.
Oh, great, great. Well, I think the majority is keep going. So we'll do the democratic process and go with the majority. This is anthrax, and we're going to finish early. So you're not going to, we're going to finish early anyway. So we're on number 7, I'm going to 20. So you won't have to sit here for 2.5 hours without a break. But the answer to number 7 is this is anthracnose. Again, it's a disease. We kind of had a wet spring last year, and after wet springs, we see anthracnose. Now, anthracnose is the name of a symptom, kind of like a headache. And we see it in trees, typically maple, walnut, ash. But I want to emphasize that it's actually a related fungus, but a slightly different fungus that infects each of those separate trees. So the one that infects maple won't infect walnut or ash. But as a rule, if it's a wet, rainy spring, we'll often see anthracnose in all of those tree species commonly. But maple seems to be most common. And you can tell it's anthracnose because the lesions will often follow the veins. You know, it's not like scorch where it's just on the edges of the leaves mostly, but it tends to follow the veins. And the leaf can get a little bit crinkled. This is what you're going to hear me say a lot of times, that this is one of those diseases that does not need to be controlled. And we have so many more of those than we have diseases that must be controlled. But it'll cause the leaves, some of the leaves will get bad enough and a few of them will drop off. But 2 key reasons why it doesn't need to be controlled is it often infects the leaves early in the spring, and only a few of them will drop off. But it's early enough in the season that the tree, if it needs to, if there's fairly heavy defoliation, that a healthy tree will just send out new leaves in relief. And this happens, sycamore is most commonly infected with anthracnose and the most severely infected. A sycamore can be infected early in the spring and drop close to 100% of its leaves. And an otherwise healthy tree will typically relief. And our temperate zone trees have the ability to do that because they have secondary buds, and they have the ability to do that because it's not unusual where we get a late spring freeze. And a lot of those leaves are damaged by a late spring freeze, and the tree will develop that secondary bud and shoot it out so it has enough foliage to get it through the summer. So anthracnose. Something is eating my rose leaves. What can I spray? Again, I'm sharing with you the actual question that the client did ask. No, thanks, Elizabeth. Give you guys a minute to discuss it locally. Again, if you want to type something in, leafcutter bees, way to go, Dakota. Yes, distinctly leafcutter bees, beneficial pollinators. I always say enjoy it. It's cool. And usually, you know, and there's plenty of green foliage there. You know, a question I often ask homeowners is, you know, they'll call and say, my plant, my tree, my shrub, whatever, is dropping all kinds of leaves. The ground is covered with the leaves. and I will say, look up at the tree. Does it look fully leafed or still? Are there lots of leaves still on the plant? Does it still look fully leafed? Or does it look very, very bare? Do you have bare branches? And a lot of times, they're focusing on all those leaves on the ground. And you look up at the tree and there's still plenty of green tissue, green foliage. Those leaves that are damaged, they're still photosynthesizing. And they're still producing food for the plant through photosynthesis. So again, we don't want to be applying an insecticide in this case because we want to be protecting our pollinators. What is this white stuff on my tree? This one, I actually thought it was woolly aphids when I first saw it, and I was wrong. It's something else. They looked a little bit different than I was used to woolly aphids looking. I know I talked about woolly aphids earlier on the maple, and they were grayish purple, but there's also some woolly aphids. They'll get really, really white once they develop all their white waxy filaments. Scale, Panhandle's guessing scale. Okay, this is a plant hopper nymph. A plant hopper nymph, and I took the picture and I sent it to Jim Kalish. So it was identified by Jim Kalish. And again, they do some feeding on sap, but Jim shared with me that they're a pretty rare thing that we see and usually nothing to be too concerned about. This particular sample was in late September. So about the end of the season anyway. So plant hopper nymphs. I found these growing in a ditch. What are the berries? Can I eat them? And you can see I'm really all over the table tonight. I mean, I've got tree questions. It seems like there's a lot of tree questions because you know what? The last few years we've had mostly tree questions. But that's kind of the way it is. If you're at a Ask a Master Gardener booth, if you're in the extension office, you're getting all kinds of different questions. So I'm not doing just trees or just shrubs or just vegetables. I'm trying to bring these questions up as they would come in to the extension office. What do you do for plant hopper nymphs? You don't have to do anything for them. As I said, Jim, this was in September. It was the end of the growing season. Sorry, that's okay. You can just close the door. Sorry. Excuse me. I'm teaching a class. I'm so sorry. Okay. Somebody was trying to talk to me. So that's why there's just a little bit of everything here. But anybody, what was the timing on number 10 again? The timing. Or the answer? I haven't given you the answer yet. Oh, the time of the year. Okay, good question. I should remember this one. This was emailed to me. I can't remember. I'm sorry. I'm thinking it was in June or July, but it might have been later. See how important that time of the year is? Of course, when we're getting the question, we know exactly what time of the year is. But when you take the picture and then you forget. But this is common European buckthorn. And I intentionally put this one in here for a couple of reasons. Well, just to remind you, this was a sample I ended up sending to Vaughn Hammond, for those of you that remember Vaughn. He still lets us send them pictures every now and then. And this thorn right here was the thorn right there on the tip of the branch is what gave this away. And Vaughn identified it for me as a common buckthorn. It is toxic as well, but it's also an invasive species. So we're starting to do a lot more programming in extension. Nicole Stoner can tell you more about invasive species than I can, but one of our issue teams is invasive species. So we're trying to get people to be more aware of what plants may eventually become invasive in a community. And this is different from noxious. A lot of invasive species are noxious weeds too, but they're not necessarily a legally noxious weed. and we're trying to discourage the planting of certain plants. And common buckthorn is one of those. But again, this looks like it could be a chokecherry. And she said, please repeat the name again. It's common buckthorn. Again, I'll say it, common buckthorn. What is this weed in my lawn and what can I use to kill it? And this is, it's not the greatest sample. When we do training, a lot of times on weed ID, we find the best picture we can find. But when you're doing plant diagnostics, you often get samples that are not ideal. They've been in the car a little too long. So, but this is not too bad. This is actually in good shape. You can take your fingers and you can pull it apart and you can look at it closely. I don't know if some of you are seeing the little yellow balls of flowers right here. I'm trying to find a leaf. You can kind of see the leaf here. It looks kind of like a clover leaf. Trifoliate. Yeah, Dakota County is, I think you're back on common buckthorn, and yes, birds can definitely spread the plant by eating the berries. And Panhandle, you're correct. This is black medic. Okay, black medic. Can sometimes identify, it's more of a perennial. It's sometimes identified as a short-lived perennial or an annual, but it acts more like a perennial. But it can act like an annual as well. And it's most common in lawns where, the thing with lawns, when it comes to plant diagnostics, I always remind the homeowner, weeds are not a problem. Weeds are a sign of a problem. So what's the problem? Why is your lawn not competing with these weeds? So what I try to help them with when it comes to weed control in a lawn is I try to figure out why is their lawn not competing with and shading out these weeds, rather than just giving them the answer of here's what you'd spray to kill this plant. So with plant diagnostics, that's sometimes it's taking a step back and saying, well, why does the plant or the lawn have the problem to begin with? And that's how we can best help homeowners and the clients out there. But this is black medic. It tends to grow on lawns that are compacted. So if you want to control it, we usually control it with the post-emergence herbicides. You can apply it either early, in the spring when you first start seeing it, or you can apply it in the fall. But it'll keep coming back unless the homeowner, maybe they need to be power raking if they have excess thatch. More likely, they possibly need to be doing some core aeration on the lawn. They might need to be raising the mowing height on their lawn mower. So those are the things that we need to be sharing with our clientele, not just identifying the insect, the disease, the weed, but why is the problem occurring to begin with. That's part of our diagnostics. Okay, this one you should know the answer. So different picture, but why are my tomato leaves rolling up? Could they have been sprayed with something, and can I still eat them? Not seeing any chatting. But again, this is physiological leaf roll. And some varieties of tomatoes are more apt to show this. It's usually related to excessive heat, maybe excess nitrogen, severe pruning. If you're the client does pruning on their plant. Other environmental factors. The plant, if you unfurl the plant, if you kind of roll it open, it'll look pretty normal. It'll look like a normal leaf. The veins won't be distorted. It'll look very, very normal. But the leaves roll up, and there's really not much we can do about it. If it's an issue year after year, then this is a good example of record keeping of your varieties, and it might be time to switch to a new variety. In this particular case, you've got it growing in a black container. So those can absorb a lot of heat. And if the homeowner's only option is to grow their tomatoes in a container for some reason, then we might want to even recommend that they change their container to a different style or type. It almost looks metal, might be plastic, but it is black. And maybe that's the issue. Okay, I put these side by side on purpose, but why are my tomato leaves curled and twisted? Again, if you look really closely here, you can distinctly tell the difference between these two pictures. In the previous picture, the leaves were just folded up, rolled up, but if you unfurled them, they looked completely normal. These, the veins are very distorted. A lot of times this is herbicide injury. And a lot of times with herbicide injury, especially 2,4-D, some of the growth regulator herbicides, it'll cause those veins to kind of they just kind of claw up together. As well as the curling, a lot of times twisting of the stem. So, and in the previous question, the question was, they're curling up, could it be herbicide? Can I still eat the tomatoes? Now that's probably what this person should have asked as well. Is it still safe to eat the tomatoes? Unfortunately, we cannot give them a science-based answer. So because they don't do research, they don't go out and spray tomatoes with 2,4-D on purpose and then do the research to determine when the tomatoes are safe to eat. So we really don't have a science-based answer to them, and we tell my answer to people is, if it's better to be safe than sorry and not eat those tomatoes. Or if it's just a little bit of herbicide on the very tips of the leaves, I can tell them the decision is yours. I can't tell you they're perfectly safe to eat, but if you choose to eat them, that's your decision that you have to make. And that's basically our answer. And Panhandle had it right. Howard County had it right for the number 12. Okay, why are some of my raspberry leaves dying? And this was one where these two pictures were emailed to me. I love that we have email. First half of my career, everything had to be brought in as a sample. And most people are very willing to send in a picture, so I try in just about every situation where a sample's not brought to my office. I can't emphasize enough how important it is to encourage people to bring in a sample. Stem borer, I think the Panhandle that's their answer. You noticing the little hole here? It's the tips, the tips, you have the tips of the growth. So the very ends or the tips are dying back. So usually when it's from the end of a branch in, the top of a plant down, then we usually start, thinking root related, or we think stem related. And in this situation where all the rest of the plant looks perfectly fine, it's just a few stems here and there, and that kind of tells you that it might be pretty localized. So, and this is raspberry cane borer. That's the answer, raspberry cane borer. And what you would see first, what the homeowner would see first, is actually at the base of where the leaves are drying up and dying back, they might see some damage, just kind of a ring of damage around the outside of that stem. But because it's later in the season that the borer will actually bore down through the cane and then kind of overwinter in the soil. But in this case, when you tell people, if you ask people to email you pictures, tell them to take as many pictures as possible and make sure they're clear pictures. What are these spots on my hollyhock leaves? Again, this was a sample that was brought to my office. And I took a picture of the top of the leaf and turn the leaf over and look at the bottom side. Panhandle, you got it right again. Rust. This is hollyhock rust. And with rust, again, the leaves, again, that symptom, okay, it's usually yellow, usually orange. But if you turn the leaf over with a rust disease, which is a fungal disease, you will often see these raised pustules on the bottom or the underside of the leaf. And that helps to tell you. You can be in hollyhock. Good sanitation is probably the best control for hollyhock leaf rust. Just making sure you clean these plants up, remove these leaves, clean the plants up. Don't do overhead irrigation. Rarely is a fungicide control needed, although it can be if the homeowner wants to do that. Again, it would have to be early in the spring. Once it's at this stage, it's much too late. Will not help to apply a fungicide. I always remind people that fungicides do not kill fungus in most cases. There's a few exceptions. They do not kill the fungus. What they do is they prevent, you get the layer, that's why you have to get thorough coverage of the leaf surface. The fungal spore lands on that, and then when that fungal spore tries to, I use the term germinate and infect the plant, that's when it kills that spore or that germinating spore, so it cannot infect the plant. But people seem to have this sense that if I spray my plant, it's going to kill the fungus that's there, so next year I won't get it. Unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. And how do you get rid of cane borers? The way you get rid of cane borers, let me go back to that one. You were wondering about how to get rid of cane borers. The adult is actually a beetle, okay? And they can emerge in a little bit later, probably June. They're not real common. So if you wanted to control them, once they're inside, it's like any borer, once they're inside the stem, you really can't control them. You could, if you notice some of this browning early in the season on the tip, you could prune about 8 inches. Sometimes, like I said, you'll notice a little bit of a ring of injury, maybe right below this damage. You could prune it out and discard it really early in the season. If it was a common problem and you had the issue, you'd have to know about the time of the year for your area, that it's commonly infesting plants or the beetle is present, and that's when you'd have to be doing any spraying. So again, if you had a June-bearing raspberry, that wouldn't work very well. So most of the time, luckily, it's not a real common issue. But pruning, so mechanically pruning and mechanically discarding that material, so sanitation might be helpful. Otherwise, it's a matter of we're dealing with an edible plant. So to try to apply a systemic or something like that typically is not feasible. Why are my apples rotting on the bottom? I've been envisioning that you're all chatting with each other and trying to solve the problem. Fruit wasp. I diagnose this as bitter rot, especially being given the concentric rings. There's another disease called white rot that can be quite similar to this on apples. And the only way I would have known, the homeowner, I asked them if they wanted me to send in a sample, and they did not. So in this case, we diagnosed it as bitter rot, and in this, they did not want to do any kind of spraying, so we just recommended that they do a lot of sanitation and clean up and discard any apple that was infected. They hadn't had the issue in past years, so they were just going to wait and see. In this case, the homeowner just wanted to wait and see if it would continue to be a major problem. But bitter rot is a fungal disease, and you kind of get sunken lesions, or sometimes with this little bit of a concentric ring in it. Okay, so and if the fungus can overwinter in in dead wood or even the mummies of these fruits, so that sanitation is very, very important. Same thing with white rot. It's similar situation. So sanitation is probably most critical. With white rot, I believe the pathogen, the fungus, can actually overwinter on the plant, like in cracks and crevices. So it's a difficult one to control. But you'd have to, if you applied a fungicide, it would have to be applied early in the spring, just as the tree is leafing out, and probably right at petal drop when that small fruit is starting to develop. I agree, Nicole, it kind of looks like blossom end rot. Okay, why does my lawn have a dark green ring? This is a fairly common one. It's not real common, but it's pretty easy answer. Fairy ring is right from the Panhandle. Panhandle, you're just right on top of everything because you want to go home. I am trying to speed things up. I only gave you 10 minutes for the break, or 20 minutes instead of 30 minutes for the hands-on thing. We skipped the break, and I was trying to wrap up at 1:45 so there'd be time for questions. So I think we're going to get done here and easily by 8:30, if not before. So I hope that helps you out west. This is fairy ring. Fairy ring is, it's a fungus, but it's a mushroom fungus. And if you look really closely, not always, but sometimes you'll see the fruiting bodies, which are the actual mushrooms growing in this ring. But you'll often not ever see the fruiting bodies themselves unless it's kind of a wet year or the homeowner overwaters their lawn. They believe the dark ring is actually caused by, the mycelium of the fungus, or the fungus itself actually decomposing and creating nitrogen. And so that's why you kind of get that darker ring from the compost. And it can get bad. It can get so dense that sometimes this can actually die out where that ring is. It can actually die out. It doesn't happen often, but it can, and they believe that's because that mycelium of that fungus gets so dense and so thick that it just actually does not it repels water. And there really is no fungicide spray for this. The only thing I've ever heard, they sometimes say if you power rake the area, especially if there's more than one ring in a lawn, that if you go in there and power rake, that for some reason, if you mix those fungi up, they kind of antagonize each other or something. And some people have done that and it's gone away. But maybe it's just a matter of removing excess thatch that the fungus is actually attracted to or growing to in the same case. But this is a fairy ring. You'll sometimes see mushrooms in it. You can apply a fungicide, cannot apply a fungicide to control it. Okay, my pine tree trunk is full of holes and the needles have this white stuff on them. What is it? Okay, to speed things along. Well, the holes, it's two separate issues. They're not connected. It's possible, pine bark beetle and scale. Good job. The holes in the pine tree itself, there's a number of beetles. If you're out west, it could be mountain pine beetle. If you're in the east, it could be Ips pine beetle. More likely, but there's a number of pine bark beetles out there. And the Nebraska Forest Service website, they have an excellent small publication on the different pine beetles in Nebraska. So that's a good source to go to. Usually it's like any borer, once it's in the tree and it's riddled to this point. If the tree is really, really healthy, chances are it isn't, which is why those beetles are in there to begin with. But the trees can live a long time with this. And there are sprays. There are insecticide sprays at certain times of the year if the homeowner wants to, that you can spray on the tree. And it might help. But with any bore, once, especially at this point where you have this much damage, it doesn't always help as much, or they're just difficult to control. So, but if they don't have the pine bark beetle, and they can help the tree to live as long as possible by controlling the scale. This is pine needle scale. And with scales, you can always take your thumb and you can kind of flick those little white spots off. Any kind of scale. If it's oyster shell scale on lilacs, they're kind of bronze colored, but you can still flick the scales off. And that's how you know it's a scale insect and not a natural part of the plant. In this case, it's obvious it's not a natural part of the plant, but there's a little insect underneath there and it's feeding on the sap of the needles. This is pretty heavy. If a large part of the pine tree is this heavily infested with pine needle scale, it's going to cause some stress for that plant and potentially some dieback. So, excuse me. The problem with scales is once they're at this stage, they have that waxy white covering over them, protecting them. And so it's pretty difficult to control them at this stage. Almost all scales, you want to control them in the crawler stage. So you have to know, again, this is where that knowledge is a tool. You have to know what time of the year they hatch, the eggs hatch. The majority of them in Nebraska, they overwinter as eggs underneath that scale and they hatch in the spring. And so you want to be doing that white paper test or something like that, and when the crawlers are present, that is when you would apply an insecticide to control scale insects. Now on a lot of pine trees, I might see a few of these scales scattered here and there on the tree, and in a case like that, I'll often tell the homeowner to just watch the plant, and if it never gets any worse than that, don't attempt to apply an insecticide. I think the thinking is if I don't spray something and I don't control it now, the population is going to explode and get out of hand. But it's fine, again, that's where knowledge is the tool, depending on the insect, but with many of them, it's fine to watch it for a while. The population is low to begin with, because a lot of times there's natural things and beneficial things like parasites that will come in and control it for you. But it bears monitoring and watching. And Norfolk is saying acephate is a systemic. You're right, the systemic, and thanks, it's probably Wayne out there. And systemics can control when they're underneath that waxy scale, if you do use a systemic insecticide. And again, if a pine tree, especially a younger pine tree, every needle was this heavily infested, I would consider control. But if it's just a few here and there on the plant, I think it would warrant watching. And it's not an edible. Remember with the raspberry, I said that's an edible plant, so we're usually not using systemics, and very few are registered for those. But this is a pine tree, so the systemics are registered. Thanks, Norfolk. Wayne, if that's you, thank you. What is this? Should I remove it and destroy it? Wasp nest or gall, praying mantis officia. Okay, I'll have to ask on if cutting a section out of the trunk of what to control what. You might type from Kime Hall if you want to, and John, which question are we referring to? But the rest of you, yes, this is a praying mantis sac, okay? And it's nothing that needs controlling. It doesn't even need to be destroyed. It's a praying mantis egg sac. And this was a fun picture I took. I came to work one morning and this was what greeted me on the side of the courthouse building. It's a Chinese mantid, the great big one, with a Carolina mantid on its back. And it's kind of comical because Chinese mantid will eat the Carolina mantid. And so this Carolina mantid, I guess, was pretty smart that day. Figured out a way not to get eaten by this Carolina mantid. This was just one of those fun pictures, and I just decided to throw it in. Okay, the pine tree. Well, cutting out a chunk of a trunk is never a good thing. I think that was the question, is asking if cutting a section out of the trunk is a good means of control. And you're talking about the pine bark beetles. No, that will not control. That will only cause damage to the trunk, and if the tree is stressed for some other reason, and that's why the pine bark beetles are in there to begin with, it won't seal off that wound, and you probably end up getting decay down the road in there. So. Unrelated, but is there a neb guide on how to plant a mat? A mat of what? Sorry. Different from what we have seen. I get panhandle, I don't know what's different from what you've seen. Thanks on the nice picture. I was forced to type that the Lincoln crowd is not serious at all. Tim, you just shouldn't listen to them. They're being ornery. Okay, I think I'm already up to my last question. Why are my tree leaves turning brown? Webworms is one answer. And I don't know if that Buffalo is saying as recently shown on Saturday's Backyard Farmer. If you're talking about my Carolina mantid and Chinese mantid question, I shared that picture with Jim Kalish because I knew he'd enjoy it. So if he's using it and showing it, that's great. I told him to use it however he wanted to. And if you're not talking about that picture, then let me know what you're talking about. Okay, I'm only getting webworms. Wayne is holding back. Okay. This is actually bagworm on a shade tree. I still don't know what you mean by a mat being planted. I'm sorry. But back to question number 20. This is bagworm on a shade tree. And this is what bagworms look like when they're about a ½ inch here. They're even tinier than that. Now bagworms are, again, there's a little insect inside there, and it's just taking leaf tissue and it's creating a little nest for itself. And it moves around on the plant and it feeds. You can kind of see the leaves. We call it skeletonizing, because when they were smaller, they're just going to scrape that green leafy tissue off of there. Okay. And as they get bigger, then they're starting to chomp on the edge of the leaf. Okay, but we don't worry. This is another one. Bagworm can be a very serious issue on our evergreens. Okay, so with bagworms, control is recommended on evergreens. It is definitely recommended on our evergreens. And we usually recommend spraying after the eggs hatch. They overwinter. All of a sudden I went blank, Wayne. I think yes, the overwinter is eggs inside of that sac. I was thinking it was maybe the overwintered as the pregnant female. If I'm wrong, Wayne, remind me. From 1 year to the next year, I'm getting old enough, I forget those exact details. Anyway, when they hatch out, late May, early June is when they hatch out. And when they're really tiny, Bacillus thuringiensis is an organic control that homeowners can use on our evergreens. And we actually don't recommend control on our broadleaf trees. If a homeowner really, really wants to, you can, again, it'd be the same recommendation. When they're really tiny, early in the season, maybe an eighth to a fourth of an inch to half inch long, that might be stretching it, but that Bacillus thuringiensis works very well. Otherwise, as they get older and they're starting to mature and chew and feed, then we need to use some of the other insecticides. Carbaryl, acephate, pyrethrins will work as well. The thing with on evergreens with bagworms is once they stop feeding sometime in August, insecticides are not going to work. And then this time of the year, if you have them, you just pick them off and discard them. But they can be pretty loaded. The plant can be pretty loaded, and that will help. It'll reduce the population, but it isn't always 100% control. Yeah, I thought it was the eggs inside of the female bags. So the small caterpillars can spread by ballooning, and that is how they balloon. When they first hatch in the spring, they actually create a little web, and they kind of balloon out, and that's how they will blow on the wind from tree to tree, and that's how they spread, even though they're so tiny. And these things are tiny. I had somebody bring in a sample, and I couldn't even see the bagworms or find the bagworm, but I set the sample down on my desk, and I have a white pad there. I picked it up and turned around. I was going to look under the microscope. I turned back, and these little brown triangles were walking around moving around on the mat on my desk. And I went, oh, you have bagworms. But they were pretty tiny at that stage. So that was my last one. Again, we got done almost a half an hour early, in part because I didn't use as much time for the hands-on activity. I didn't give you a break. And I kind of sped through these last questions. I was going to have you take time to discuss each one and chat more answers, but I can appreciate your concern with the weather out west. Any questions for me? Okay, the app, there probably is an app for that. I know that there's a lot of plant ID apps where you can take a picture of the plant itself, and it will automatically give you a bunch of suggestions of what they think this plant is. With all the apps out there today, I can't imagine that there aren't some plant, disease, insect. Yeah, I have not looked for them myself. If anybody is aware of any, let us know. They'd have to be pretty specific to a location, because what we find even in eastern Nebraska is different than what we often find in western Nebraska. So that's the problem there. And on the plant diagnostic guide, you can just order that from marketplace.unl.edu. There's a lot of color to that. So it is, I don't remember the expense, the cost of it. If somebody remembers, type it in there. It's available on marketplace.unl.edu, or as Master Gardeners, you could ask your local extension office if they would be willing to order that for you. I offer it to my Master Gardeners, and anybody that wants to pay for it, purchase it and pay for it. We go ahead and order 2, 3 at the beginning of the year, if that's how many people want it, and then they just pay me for it. Okay, tomato fruit has bottom rot. If somebody's asking what's causing that, it's most likely blossom end rot. If that's why, Frontier County, if that's why you're asking, is that actually a question? I assume it's actually a question. When tomatoes rot on the bottom, kind of a leathery rot, kind of brownish, it's usually blossom end rot, and some varieties are more likely, it's not a disease, not an insect, it's physiological. Some varieties are more likely to get it than others. Usually it's those first few early fruits. The actual cause is a lack of calcium in the fruit, but there's usually plenty of calcium in the soil. It's just that the leaves, especially if the leaves are growing very succulently, there's been a lot of irrigation, a lot of rain, maybe excess nitrogen, and the leaves are using the calcium and not enough is getting to the fruit. But with most varieties of tomatoes, it seems like they kind of adjust, and then the later fruit are not affected by blossom end rot. Thanks for the beautiful garden. I'll tell my mom that, she's here. Is there any control for the thrips on the onions? Yes, there is a control. They're difficult to control, but you need to start very early in the season when the onions are young, because what they do is they tend to get down into that whorl. And once they're down and hiding down inside that whorl of that plant, they're a little bit more difficult to control. But there are insecticides labeled for use on onion thrips. They have to be labeled for use on vegetables and say that they will control the onions. Whoops, sorry. I was trying to scroll through the chat. Mat of growing medium with small seedlings planted within the mat. I know there's a lot of, there's a lot of different, I'm back to that question about the mat and planting the mat. And I know there's a lot of things like that that are available on the market anymore, where you just buy the mat and you lay down the mat and it already comes, with the seed embedded in it, and you start watering it. I've seen them for wildflowers, and I'm guessing there's probably additional ones out there. There's a new message. Okay, thanks, Kelly. Great program. Yes, panhandle if you need to leave. Drive safe. Keep the snow or use it all up before it gets out here. We need moisture. I'm just thinking of my parents who have to drive north. If there's no other questions, I'll stay here for just a little bit. But everybody